Welcome. Today we drift into a corner of London that no longer appears on any map, a place erased by time, yet heavy with lives once pressed into its shadows. This is not the story of kings or grand streets. It is the story of a narrow passage, forgotten by the city that built it, a street so tight that light struggled to enter and survival was never guaranteed. We step back into a street to walk where thousands once lived unseen, to listen to echoes the city chose to silence, and to remember a place London allowed to disappear. Let us begin. Imagine standing at the edge of a street so narrow it feels less like a road and more like a crack in the city itself. A place where the walls lean inward as if they are tired of standing, as if they want to close the space entirely and seal away whatever lives inside. The air is heavy here, unmoving, carrying the stale scent of damp wood, human breath, and long-petaled grime. Daylight struggles to enter, and when it does, it arrives weak and thin, like a reluctant visitor who never stays long. This was a street, once known as the narrowest street in London, and one of its most quietly brutal. The street did not announce itself. There were no grand arches, no signposts inviting strangers to pass through. It existed almost by accident, squeezed between larger, louder streets near Drury Lane and the Strand. Thousands of people walked nearby every day without ever noticing it. And that was the point. The street was not meant to be seen. It was not part of the London that celebrated progress, trade, or empire. It belonged to another London altogether, the one hidden behind brick and shadow. To understand the street, you must first forget the image of London that survives in paintings and postcards. Forget wide boulevards and elegant townhouses. Forget gaslit theaters and bustling coffeehouses. The street was part of an older city, one that had grown without planning, without mercy, and without concern for those who would one day be forced to live inside its narrow confines. It was a remnant of medieval London that somehow survived into a more modern age, long after it should have been torn down. The street took its name from an old word connected to bends, corners, and twisting paths, and twisted it was. The buildings that formed the street were not aligned with any sense of order. They leaned, sagged, and pressed toward each other, their upper floors jutting out so far that in some places the sky disappeared completely. From one window, a resident could easily reach out and touch the wall opposite. In others, neighbors could pass objects back and forth without ever stepping outside at ground level. The street narrowed even further. In certain stretches, two people could not pass side by side without turning their bodies. Carts could not enter. Horses avoided it. Even foot traffic was hesitant. The street was a place you entered only if you had a reason or nowhere else to go, and many had nowhere else. London had always been a city of opportunity, but opportunity came with a price. As the population exploded, housing could not keep pace. The wealthy expanded outward, claiming cleaner air and wider spaces, while the poor were pushed inward into the city's forgotten corners. The street became one of those corners. Over time, it filled with people who had fallen through every safety net the city pretended to offer. Yet the street was not always infamous. In its earliest days, it was simply another narrow lane in a crowded medieval city, no worse than many others. But while surrounding streets were widened, rebuilt, or cleared away, the street remained trapped in time. Each new generation of buildings was constructed on top of the old without removing what lay beneath. The result was a fragile vertical maze, floors stacked on floors, beams resting on beams, all slowly rotting from the inside. By the time London entered the age of reform and industrial power, the street had already become an embarrassment. Writers described it with unease. Visitors who stumbled upon it spoke of the sudden darkness, the silence broken only by muffled voices and the echo of footsteps. It felt separate from the city around Itaz, though you had stepped through an invisible door into another world. What made the street truly unsettling was not just its physical narrowness, but the sense that it had been forgotten by time itself. Laws changed, building standards improved, sanitation became a public concern, but none of this reached the street. It existed in a legal and moral gray area, ignored because dealing with it would require effort, money, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about poverty. The street became a container for lives that London did not wish to acknowledge. It absorbed failure, desperation, and exhaustion. People arrived quietly and disappeared just as quietly. No one recorded their stories in detail. No one marked their passing. And so the street grew heavier with every year, not just with bodies and buildings, but with unspoken history. At night, the street became even narrower. Without proper lighting, darkness pulled between the walls, thick and absolute. Sounds traveled strangely here. A whisper could carry the length of the street, while a scream might feel swallowed by brick. Residents learned to recognize one another not by sight, but by footsteps, coughs, and voices echoing through the confined space. For outsiders, the street inspired fear. For those who lived there, it inspired something more complex: resignation. People did not speak of the street as a temporary stop. It was understood, quietly and without discussion, that arriving on the street often meant staying longer than you intended, sometimes for life. Children born there learned early that their world was smaller than most. Their games took place in darkness and mud. Their sense of space was shaped by walls that pressed in on all sides. For them, London was not a grand city of opportunity, but a narrow passage that smelled of damp wood and human survival. And yet, even in such confinement, life persisted. People adapted. They learned how to exist in spaces barely wide enough to breathe. They learned when to speak and when to stay silent. They learned how to move sideways through the city, unnoticed and unrecorded. The street did not demand attention, it endured quietly. That endurance is what made it dangerous to polite society, because as long as the street existed, it stood as evidence that progress was uneven, that prosperity had limits, and that some lives were considered acceptable losses. Eventually, the pressure to erase such places became irresistible. But before demolition, before reformers and officials finally acted, the street lived for centuries as a scar running through the heart of London, a scar most people chose not to look at. This is where its story truly begins, not with destruction, but with existence. With a street so narrow, it seemed impossible, yet real enough to shape thousands of lives. A street that no longer exists, but once forced human beings to survive within inches of one another, pressed together by history, poverty, and neglect. The street was not just a place, it was a warning, quiet, dark, and easy to ignore. The street was not shaped by intention or foresight. It emerged from neglect, from repetition, from centuries of decisions made without regard for those who would live with the consequences. It was a street formed not by design, but by compression of land, of bodies, of time itself. Every inch of its narrowness told a story of how London grew, without stopping to consider who would be crushed beneath that growth. The buildings that formed the street were never meant to last as long as they did. Many began as modest medieval structures erected when London was still a dense tangle of lanes and alleys. In those early years, narrow streets were common. Space inside the city walls was precious, and builders pushed as close to one another as possible. What mattered was not light, not air, but proximity, being near markets, employers, and sources of trade. The street was born in this environment, when survival depended on closeness and compromise. But cities are supposed to change. Streets widen, buildings are replaced, and old mistakes are corrected. The street did not change. It was built upon again and again without ever being rebuilt as generations passed. Owners added upper floors instead of tearing structures down. Timber beams were stacked on timber beams. Brick was laid over brick. Each addition leaned slightly forward, encroaching further into the already narrow space below. Over time, the upper stories of the buildings began to jut out dramatically, nearly touching across the street. From below, the street no longer felt open to the sky, felt enclosed, like a corridor with no ceiling, where daylight had to squeeze its way in sideways. Even at midday, shadows clung stubbornly to the ground. The sun never truly reached the street floor. It only brushed the upper walls briefly before moving on. Rainwater followed the same pattern. It dripped and trickled downward, never fully evaporating. The street floor remained damp year-round, a mixture of mud, waste, and rotting debris. Drainage was poor or non-existent. The narrowness made it impossible to install proper channels, and so water simply collected wherever it could. Wooden foundations soaked it up, slowly weakening from below. Stone cracked, mortar crumbled. The buildings stood not because they were strong, but because they had not yet collapsed. The air in the street barely moved. With walls so close together, wind could not circulate. Smoke from hearths and candles lingered, trapped between brick and timber. In warmer months, the street became oppressive thick with heat and odor. In winter, it became a cold, damp tunnel where moisture clung to clothing and bones alike. Residents learned to live with a constant chill of indoors. The air in the street barely moved. With walls so close together, wind could not circulate. Smoke from hearths and candles lingered, trapped between brick and timber. In warmer months, the street became oppressive thick with heat and odor. In winter, it became a cold, damp tunnel where moisture clung to clothing and bones alike. Residents learned to live with a constant chill of indoors, even beside a fire. Inside the buildings, conditions were no better. Rooms were small, ceilings low, windows, if they existed, faced directly into other windows or walls. Privacy was impossible. Light was scarce. Many rooms remained dim even during the brightest days, forcing occupants to burn candles or oil lamps long before evening arrived. These flames provided light but also danger. In a street this tight, fire was not a possibility. It was an inevitability, waiting for the right moment. Staircases were steep and uneven, worn smooth by centuries of feet. Floors creaked under weight they were never meant to bear. Entire families lived in single rooms, stacked vertically in buildings that leaned so far forward they seemed ready to topple. Each structure depended on its neighbor for balance. Remove one and the others would follow. This interdependence created a fragile equilibrium. The street existed in a constant state of tension, held together by habit and fear. No one dared make significant repairs because altering one building could destabilize the rest. No one invested in improvement because the returns were minimal. Landlords took rent but gave little back. Tenants endured what they could not change. The street's narrowness also meant that services could not reach it. Carts could not pass through. Fire engines could not enter. Waste collection was irregular at best. What could not be removed was simply left where it fell. Over time, layers of refuse built up, compacted by feet and rain into a foul, uneven surface. The street itself became a kind of living organism, absorbing everything discarded into it. Urban reformers would later describe the street as a failure of planning, but, in truth, it was a success of indifference. It survived because no one with power felt responsible for it. It existed in the gap between jurisdictions, between priorities, between concern and neglect. Too small to matter, too inconvenient to address it, was allowed to persist long after. Its dangers were obvious. The narrowness of the street also shaped behavior. People moved carefully sideways, at times avoiding contact when possible. Arguments echoed loudly, amplified by the close walls. So did laughter, crying, and suffering. There was no escaping sound. Every life overlapped with another. In such proximity, tempers frayed quickly. So did nerves. Yet people adapted, developing an unspoken code of coexistence that allowed them to survive without constant conflict. Visitors who ventured into the street often described a feeling of unease, though the street itself was watching them. The closeness of the walls created the illusion of movement, of pressure. Some said it felt as though the buildings were slowly closing in. This sensation was not entirely imagined. Over decades, the structures did continue to shift, settle, and lean, responding to gravity and decay in ways too subtle to notice day by day, but unmistakable over generations. The narrowness also ensured invisibility from the main roads nearby. The street was easy to miss. Its entrance could be mistaken for a gap between buildings, a service passage, or a private alley. This invisibility protected it, but also condemned it. Out of sight meant out of mind, as long as it did not spill its problems into the wider city. It could be ignored. This physical compression mirrored a social one. People living on the street were pushed together by circumstance, grounded not just in space, but in opportunity. There was no room to grow, no room to retreat. Every failure was witnessed, every weakness exposed. The street itself became a symbol of containment, a place where the city stored what it could not fix. Even the word street feels misleading. The street functioned more like a passageway, a seam between larger structures, yet it housed lives, families, histories. It forced human existence into a space barely wider than a hallway, then demanded endurance as payment for shelter. To live there was to accept constraint as a permanent condition. As London modernized around it, the contrast became sharper. Wider streets appeared nearby. New buildings rose with straight lines and deliberate spacing. Light and air became commodities, valued by those who could afford them. The street remained unchanged, a dark vein running through a city that claimed to be improving. This is what it means to say the street was built to suffocate, not by malice, but by accumulations, by centuries of small decisions that favored convenience over care, by a system that allowed structures to grow inward until there was barely space left for breath, by a city that expanded outward while leaving its oldest wounds unhealed. The narrowness was not accidental. By the time it reached its final form, it was tolerated, maintained, accepted, and in that acceptance lay its cruelty. Because once a place is accepted as unfixable, the people inside it are treated the same way. The street did not simply trap bodies, it compressed lives, ambitions, and futures into a space too tight to hold them. And yet people lived there. They woke, worked, loved, argued, and aged within inches of one another, inside buildings that seemed to lean closer every year. The street stood as long as it did because it balanced on the edge of collapse, structurally, socially, and morally. It was a reminder that cities are not just built with stone and timber, but with priorities. And when those priorities exclude the vulnerable, the result is a place like the street, narrow, dark, and heavy with the weight of everything society chose not to address. This was the environment into which people stepped when they entered the street, not a temporary hardship, not an unfortunate detour, but a space engineered by neglect to press inward, to limit movement, and to make survival itself a daily effort. People did not arrive on the street by accident. No one wandered into its narrow darkness out of curiosity and decided to stay. Arrival here was almost always the final step in a long process of loss, of work, of family, of health, of reputation, or simply of luck. The street was not a beginning. It was where stories went when they had run out of better places to go. London drew people in relentlessly from the countryside, from smaller towns, from across Britain and beyond. They came chasing wages, security, and the promise that the city always seemed to offer from a distance. But London rewarded only some. For the rest, it took more than it gave. When employment vanished, when illness struck, when a household lost its primary earner, the descent could be swift and unforgiving. Each step downward meant cheaper lodging, smaller rooms, darker streets. The street waited at the bottom of that ladder. Many of its residents had once lived respectable lives by the standards of their time. Former domestic servants dismissed without references, craftsmen whose skills had been made obsolete by changing industries, laborers injured on the job and no longer strong enough to compete for work, actors and musicians who failed to find steady income near the theaters of Drury Lane, widows left with children and no inheritance. Each had slipped slowly or suddenly until only the cheapest rooms remained available. The rent on the street was low not because it was generous, but because few other options were worse. Landlords divided buildings into ever smaller units, carving rooms into fragments of space barely fit for human occupation. A single chamber might house an entire family, with beds shared in shifts or replaced by straw on the floor. Privacy was a luxury no one expected. Survival required adaptation, not comfort. To live on the street was to accept that dignity would be tested daily. Respectability mattered in London, but here it was fragile. Clothes wore thin quickly in damp conditions. Shoes rotted from constant moisture. Cleanliness became difficult to maintain when water was scarce and waste unavoidable. Outsiders judged the residents harshly, mistaking the effects of poverty for moral failure. But those judgments rarely considered how narrow the margin for survival truly was. Children born on the street inherited its limitations from their first breath. Many never knew another home. Their earliest memories were of darkness, of voices echoing through close walls, of the constant presence of other lives pressing in from all sides. Education was sporadic at best. Some attended charity schools when places were available. Others learned nothing beyond what the street itself taught them: how to move quickly, how to listen carefully, how to endure hunger. Families were common, but stability was rare. Illness could remove a parent in days. Accidents were frequent. Without savings, without support, households collapsed easily. Children were sent to work young if they could find it, contributing what little they earned to keep the family housed. When they could not, they risked joining the ranks of the street children who drifted through nearby areas, sleeping where they could. La men also filled many rooms along the street. Some were casual laborers, hired by the day. Uncertain each morning whether work would come. Others had reputations that followed them: troublemakers, drinkers, men who had burned bridges elsewhere and found themselves unwelcome in better lodgings. For them, the street offered anonymity. Here, no one asked many questions. Past failures were common enough not to stand out. Women faced particular vulnerabilities. Employment options were limited and often exploitative. Domestic service required references and appearances. Domestic service required references and appearances that many could not maintain. Factory work was inconsistent. Washing, sewing, and selling small goods offered some income but rarely enough. For some, relationships became a means of survival. For others, prostitution was not a choice made lightly, but one made under pressure in a city that provided few alternatives. Despite this, the residents of the street were not a single uniform group. They came from different backgrounds, spoke in different accents, held different beliefs. What united them was not identity, but circumstance. They were bound together by proximity, by shared hardship, and by the understanding that no one else was likely to intervene on their behalf. Social boundaries still existed even here. Families tried to distance themselves from those considered more dangerous or disreputable. Some rooms were considered better than others based on light, dryness, or proximity to entrances. Even within extreme poverty, hierarchy found a way to survive. But these distinctions were fragilely erased by a single misfortune. The street also attracted those who needed to remain unnoticed. Its narrowness and invisibility provided cover. People fleeing debts, failed marriages, or legal trouble could disappear into its shadowed passage. In a city that recorded and categorized obsessively, the street offered a degree of obscurity, was a place where lives could fade without formal acknowledgement. The transient nature of some residents added to the street's instability. People came and went sometimes overnight. Rooms changed occupants frequently. Deaths were common, departures unannounced. The population shifted, constantly preventing strong community bonds from forming. Familiar faces disappeared with little explanation. New ones arrived, carrying their own burdens. Yet, even amid this instability, moments of solidarity emerged. Neighbors shared food when they could. Women watched over each other's children. Information about work opportunities passed quickly through whispered conversations. In such close quarters, cooperation was often necessary. Total isolation was impossible and total indifference dangerous. Still, the constant pressure took its toll. Living in such confinement eroded patience and mental resilience. Arguments broke out easily. Violence was not uncommon. Alcohol offered temporary escape but deepened long-term suffering. The street amplified every emotion: fear, anger, grief, because there was nowhere to retreat from it. Those who lived on the street understood that their address marked them. Employers judged it. Charities hesitated. Authorities watched it with suspicion. An address could determine whether someone was considered deserving of help or already lost. The street carried a stigma that extended beyond its physical boundaries, shaping how residents were treated elsewhere in the city. For many, the dream of leaving never disappeared, but it faded. Each attempt to climb back up the social ladder required resources, money, health, connections that were difficult to gather while living there. The longer one stayed, the harder escape became. Time itself worked against the residents' wearing down bodies and hopes alike. The elderly were particularly vulnerable. Without family support, they depended on charity or the goodwill of neighbors who had little to spare. Old age on the street was often quiet and lonely. Death came without ceremony. Bodies were removed, rooms relettened, life continued without pause. In this way, the street functioned as both refuge and trap. It provided shelter where none might otherwise be available, but at a cost that compounded over time. It absorbed the city's excess, suffering containing it within walls so narrow that it could not easily spill into view. London benefited from this containment as it pretended not to see it. Those who lived on the street were not inherently different from those who lived elsewhere. They were separated by circumstance, not character. Yet the street shaped the mass environment always does. It limited options, influenced choices, and left marks that were difficult to erase. Survival required constant adjustment, constant vigilance, and constant compromise. To understand who lived on the street is to understand how cities manage inequality by concentrating hardship into spaces that can be ignored. They create the illusion of progress while allowing suffering to persist out of sight. The street was one such space, a narrow channel into which lives flowed when every other path had closed. People arrived here carrying the weight of everything they had lost. They stayed because leaving required resources they no longer possessed. And as years passed, the street became not just a location, but an identity imposed upon them by the city itself. This was the human reality of the street, not monsters, not villains, not curiosities, but ordinary people pressed into extraordinary conditions. Their presence there was not evidence of failure, but of how easily a system can discard those who fall behind. Morning on the street did not arrive with light. It announced itself through sound. Before the sun had fully risen above the rooftops of London, the street was already awake. Coughs echoed, first deep, hollow, persistent. Then the scrape of boots against damp stone, the creak of floorboards above. the murmur of voices carrying through walls so thin and close that they might as well have been shared. On the street, sleep ended not when one was rested, but when the street decided it was time to move again. Light entered reluctantly. When it did, it slipped down from above in narrow strip sketching, briefly on jutting beams and crooked windows before dissolving into shadow. The ground remained dark, even at midday. Residents learned to navigate by memory, not sight. Every uneven stone, every low beam, every jutting corner was known by instinct. To misstep was to stumble into filth or collide with another body in the confined space. The smell was constant and inescapable. It was a layered odor, built up over years, impossible to trace to a single source. Rotting food, damp wood, human waste, smoke, unwashed bodies, stale drink, all of it clung to the air and to the walls themselves. Clothes absorbed it, hair carried it, skin could not escape it. Even those who left the street for work often returned smelling as though they had never gone anywhere else. Water was a daily concern. There were no private supplies. Residents relied on shared pumps and nearby sources, of them unreliable and often contaminated. Buckets had to be carried through the narrow passage, sloshing against legs and walls. Spilled water mixed with the already damp ground, feeding the perpetual wetness that never fully dried. Washing clothes was a laborious task done infrequently because it required time, effort, and access to water that might be needed for drinking or cooking instead. Cooking itself was a challenge. Many rooms had no proper hearth. Small fires burned in makeshift spaces, their smoke adding to the heavy air. Food was simple, repetitive, and often insufficient. Bread, cheap cuts of meat. When available, scraps purchased at the end of market day. Hunger was common, especially among children. Meals were stretched thin, shared carefully, and sometimes skipped entirely. Noise never stopped. The narrow walls acted as amplifiers. Every argument, every laugh, every cry carried the length of the street. Privacy was an illusion. Residents knew one another's routines, intimately, not by choice but by proximity. They heard sickness worsen through the night. They heard quarrels escalate and fade. They heard births, deaths, and everything in between. Children played where they could, which meant in the street itself. There was nowhere else. Their games were loud, improvised, and often dangerous. They dodged adults, debris, and occasional animals wandering through. They learned early how to move quickly, how to shout warnings, how to disappear into doorways when trouble appeared. Childhood here was brief and practical, shaped by necessity rather than protection. Illness was an ever-present threat. In conditions like these, disease did not spread slowly. It moved with speed and certainty. A single cough could signal the beginning of weeks of suffering. Tuberculosis lingered, wasting bodies over time. Cholera and typhus struck with terrifying suddenness. Fevers spread from room to room, carried by shared air and shared hardship. When one household fell ill, others braced themselves, knowing it was likely only a matter of time. There was little medical help available. Doctors were expensive and often reluctant to enter places like the street. Home remedies were common herbs, poultices, prayers. Neighbors did what they could for one another, sharing advice and assistance, but resources were limited. Many illnesses simply had to be endured. Survival depended as much on luck as on care. Death was familiar. It did not arrive dramatically. More often, it came quietly in the night. A body would be discovered in the morning cold, in a shared bed, or on the floor of a crowded room. There were no long pauses for mourning. Life on the street did not allow for stillness. The dead were removed when arrangements could be made, rooms cleared and space reclaimed for the living. Grief existed, but it had to fit around survival. Work for those who had it pulled residents out of the street during the day. Some walked to nearby markets, docks, workshops, or households where they labored for wages that barely covered rent. Others searched endlessly for employment, returning each evening with empty hands. The uncertainty of income added to the constant strain. A single missed payment could mean evicted, and eviction often meant something worse than the street. Those who stayed behind during the day, women caring for children, the sick, the elderly, kept the street alive in quieter ways. They fetched water. Those who stayed behind during the day, women caring for children, the sick, the elderly, they fetched water, cleaned what little could be cleaned, watched over one another's families. Information traveled quickly here. News of work, illness, death, or danger spread faster than any official notice. In such close quarters, awareness was a form of protection. Evenings brought no relief. As daylight faded, the street seemed to narrow further. Candles flickered behind small windows, their light barely reaching beyond the glass. The risk of fire increased with every flame. Residents were careful, but accidents happened. An overturned lamp, a spark catching on dry fabric. A moment of carelessness, sand panic followed. Fire spread rapidly, here leaping from building to building with terrifying speed. Escape routes were limited. Screams echoed, amplified by the walls. Those who survived such events carried the memory long after the flames were gone. Alcohol was both refuge and problem. Cheap drink offered brief escape from exhaustion and despair. Taverns nearby drew residents in, but drink often followed them home as well. Intoxication worsened arguments, fueled violence, and drained already scarce money. Yet for many it was the only available relief from relentless pressure. Judging such choices from a distance was easy. Making them in the darkness of the street was another matter entirely. Night did not bring quiet, it brought different sounds. Footsteps slowed but did not stop. Voices lowered but remained constant. Some worked late. Others returned from long shifts. Some wandered, restless and sleepless. The street never fully rested because rest required space and safety luxuries. The street could not provide. Sleep, when it came, was shallow. Beds were shared. Floors were crowded. Bodies pressed together for warmth in winter and endured suffocating closeness in summer. Dreams were easily broken by noise or movement. Fatigue accumulated day after day, wearing down resistance to illness and despair alike. Despite everything, routines formed. Humans adapt even to the most restrictive environments. People learned how to navigate around one another, how to claim small pieces of time and space. A quiet corner for a moment of solitude. A familiar voice in the darkness. A shared joke, brief but genuine. These moments did not erase hardship, but they softened it. Enough to allow endurance. The street itself seemed to observe these routines unchanged and indifferent. Its walls absorbed sound. Its ground absorbed waste. Its buildings absorbed lives day after day, the same patterns repeated, slightly altered by chance and circumstance. Births replaced deaths. New faces replaced those who vanished. The cycle continued without pause. For outsiders, the street was defined by filth and danger. For those who lived there, it was defined by familiarity. The darkness was known. The smells were expected. The risks were understood. Fear did not disappear, but it became background noise woven into daily existence. People did not wake each morning thinking about survival as an abstract concept. They lived it automatically through countless small decisions made without reflection. Daily life on the street was not dramatic in the way history often prefers. There were no grand rebellions, no sudden transformations. There was only persistence, getting through one more day, keeping children fed, avoiding illness if possible, paying rent, finding work, enduring the night. This ordinariness is what makes the street difficult to confront. Its suffering was not contained in a single catastrophe, but spread across years and generations. It did not demand attention with spectacle. It simply existed, grinding down those inside it through repetition and neglect. To live on the street was to exist in a state of constant exposure, exposed to others, to disease, to danger, to judgment. And yet, life endured, life continued. People laughed when they could. They argued, loved, despaired, and hoped within a space barely wide enough to hold them. Daily life here was not defined by one moment, but by thousands of small, exhausting ones. Together, they formed an existence shaped by darkness, proximity, and endurance, an existence that continued unnoticed by most of the city long enough to become invisible. This was the street in motion, not frozen in misery, but moving forward, each day under the weight of its own narrowness. In a place as narrow as White Street, danger did not arrive loudly. It slipped in quietly, carried by habit, by desperation, by the simple fact that too many people were pressed into too little space. Crime here was not an exception to daily life. It was woven into it, not always through malice, but through necessity. When survival itself was uncertain, morality became flexible, shaped less by principle and more by hunger. Privacy did not exist. Walls were thin. Windows faced windows, and sound traveled freely. People learned to listen without meaning to. Conversations were overheard. Arguments anticipated. Weaknesses noticed. In such conditions, secrets were almost impossible to keep. This constant exposure created an environment where trust was fragile and suspicion common. It was not that everyone was dishonest, but that honesty carried risks few could afford. Petty theft was common, a loaf of bread left unattended, a coat hung too close to a doorway, a few coins carelessly placed in any of these might disappear. Children were often involved, not because they were naturally inclined toward crime, but because they were small, quick, and desperate. Hunger teaches lessons early, and on the street, hunger was a constant instructor. Stealing was not always condemned. Sometimes it was quietly understood. Pickpockets operated easily in nearby, busier streets and markets, slipping back into the street's narrow passage to vanish from sight. Its layout made pursuit difficult. Outsiders hesitated to follow. The street's reputation alone discouraged many from entering. This provided a kind of protection, turning the very neglect that harmed residents into a shield for those engaged in illegal activity. Prostitution was present and visible. For some women, it was one of the few ways to earn money quickly and with some degree of control over their time. It was not romanticized, nor was it hidden behind closed doors. Transactions occurred openly enough that children grew up understanding things far earlier than they should have. Judgment from the outside world was harsh, but rarely accompanied by alternatives. Violence simmered beneath the surface. Arguments escalated quickly in such confined space. Alcohol-fueled tempers, old grievances, had nowhere to dissipate. A disagreement could echo through the street, drawing in neighbors, whether they wished to be involved or not. Fights broke out, sometimes over money, sometimes over noise, sometimes over nothing more than accumulated frustration. Finally finding an outlet, authorities were present, but inconsistently. Police patrols passed nearby, but entering the street required effort and willingness. The narrowness limited movement. The darkness concealed faces. Officers were often outnumbered and unfamiliar with the people who lived there. Arrests happened, but they did little to address the underlying conditions. Removing one individual changed nothing about the pressures that produced crime in the first place. Informers thrived in such an environment. When privacy is impossible, information becomes currency. Some residents exchanged knowledge for favors or protection. Others did so out of fear, hoping to avoid trouble by cooperating with those in power. This further eroded trust, creating a sense that anyone might be listening, waiting, reporting. Silence became a survival skill. Fire, however, was the greatest terror of all. In a street built almost entirely of timber and old brick, with buildings leaning into one another, fire was not a risk, it was an inevitability that everyone understood but could not escape. Candles burned constantly due to lack of light. Hearths and small stoves operated in cramped, poorly ventilated spaces. Sparks flew, flames caught when they did. The consequences were immediate and devastating. There was no room to run, no wide exits, no clear paths. Fire spread horizontally and vertically at terrifying speed, leaping from wall to wall, floor to floor. Smoke filled the narrow passage, choking those trapped below. Panic echoed louder than the flames themselves. Families scrambled to gather children, belongings abandoned in favor of life itself. Some did not make it out in time. Fire engines could not enter the street. Even if they arrived quickly, hoses could not be maneuvered effectively in such confined space. Neighbors formed bucket lines when possible, but water supplies were limited and often too far away. More often than not, residents could do little more than watch as entire sections of the street burned. After a fire, the damage extended beyond the immediate destruction. Buildings weakened by flames and water often collapsed, later sometimes without warning. Walls cracked, beams sagged, rooms became uninhabitable. Yet people returned patching what they could because there was nowhere else to go. The street absorbed disaster and continued scarred but standing. Structural collapse was another constant fear. The buildings were old, overloaded, and poorly maintained. Floors bowed under weight they were never meant to bear. Staircases shifted. Entire sections leaned precariously. Residents learned to recognize the sounds of stress, the groan of timber, the sudden crack of masonry. Sometimes these warnings came too late. When collapse occurred, it was sudden. A wall gave way, A floor dropped. People were crushed or trapped beneath debris. Rescue was slow and dangerous in such confined conditions. Neighbors dug with bare hands when tools were unavailable. Bodies were pulled free, sometimes alive. When collapse occurred, it was sudden. A wall gave way. A floor dropped. People were crushed or trapped beneath debris. Rescue was slow and dangerous in such confined conditions. Neighbors dug with bare hands when tools were unavailable. Bodies were pulled free, sometimes alive, sometimes not. Afterwards, the street closed ranks, again adapting to the new absence. Fear became a constant companion, but like all constants, it faded into the background. People learned to live with it, just as they lived with darkness and damp. To dwell on danger would have made daily life impossible. Instead, fear was managed through routine, through shared understanding, through a kind of quiet fatalism. Whatever happened, happened. The reputation of the street amplified these dangers. Outsiders saw it as a breeding ground for vice and violence, a place where crime flourished unchecked. This reputation justified neglect. It allowed the city to treat the street as irredeemable, its residents as complicit in their own suffering. Few asked why crime thrived here, or why fire and collapse were so common. Few still offered solutions. Children grew up absorbing this atmosphere. They learned early which doors to avoid, which adults to trust, which paths were safest. They learned how to read tension in voices, how to recognize danger before it erupted. These skills helped them survive, but they also shaped them, normalizing conditions that should never have been normal. Despite the danger, there was also a strange order to the street. Rules existed, spoken but understood. Certain behaviors were tolerated, others punished informally by the community. Outsiders who entered with bad intentions sometimes found themselves unwelcome. Protection was uneven, but it existed. In the absence of reliable authority, residents created their own fragile systems of control. Yet these systems could not stop the larger threats. Fire did not respect boundaries. Collapse did not discriminate. Disease ignored rules entirely. Each disaster reinforced the sense that life here was precarious, balanced on forces beyond individual control. Survival felt temporary, provisional, always subject to sudden reversal. When death came through violence, fire, or collapse, it left little trace. There were no investigations that captured public attention, no memorials. Death blended into the ongoing rhythm of loss. Rooms were cleared. New tenants arrived. The street continued as though nothing had changed. This constant exposure to danger shaped the psychology of those who lived there. Some became hardened, emotionally distant. Others lived intensely in the present, knowing the future was uncertain. Planning beyond immediate needs felt impractical. Hope narrowed to small, achievable goals. Enough food for tomorrow, rent paid for another week, children surviving another winter. The street was often described as lawless, but this description misunderstood its reality. Laws existed, but they did not function effectively here. The real governing force was scarcity. Scarcity of space, of money, of safety, of attention. Under such conditions, behavior adapted in ways that seemed criminal from the outside but felt necessary from within. Fire and fear, crime and collapse, these were not separate elements of life on the street. They fed one another. creating a cycle that was difficult to break. Neglect allowed danger to grow. Danger reinforced neglect. The street became a self-contained world of risk held together by the resilience of those forced to live inside it. To survive, the street required constant alertness and compromise. It required knowing when to look away, when to intervene, when to remain silent. It required accepting that disaster might arrive without warning, and that when it did, help would be limited. This was the price of living in a place the city had chosen to forget. Danger was not an interruption to daily life on the street. It was part of its structure, as integral as the leaning walls and narrow ground beneath one's feet. By the time the end of the street came into view, the decision had already been made elsewhere. It was not the result of a single tragedy, nor a sudden awakening of conscience. It was the slow accumulation of discomfort among those with power: officials, planners, reformers who could no longer tolerate the existence of places that contradicted the story London wanted to tell about itself. The street did not fit the image of a modern city, and so it had to go. The language used to describe the street changed first. Where once it had been ignored, it now became labeled. Reports called it a nuisance, a danger, a moral threat. Medical officers described it as a source of disease, a place where infection could spread outward into more respectable neighborhoods. Reformers spoke of it as a stain, something unhealthy, not just to the body, but to the character of the city. These descriptions were not entirely wrong, but they were incomplete. They focused on symptoms while carefully avoiding causes. The street was not condemned because of sudden concern for those who lived there. It was condemned because it embarrassed the city. It sat too close to important roads, to theaters, to areas frequented by people with influence. Its narrow darkness conflicted with new ideals of openness, order, and progress. As London expanded its reach and its self-image, it became less willing to tolerate reminders of its failures. Urban reform in the 19th century was driven by a mixture of genuine concern and self-interest. Public health movements gained momentum as outbreaks of disease threatened everyone, not just the poor. The realization that illness did not respect class boundaries made neglect harder to justify. Streets like the street were suddenly seen not merely as unfortunate, but as dangerous to the entire urban root population. Plans were drawn, surveys conducted, measurements taken. The same precision that had been absent for centuries now appeared, focused on removal rather than repair. The street was deemed beyond saving to narrow, to widen easily, too unstable, to renovate safely, too embedded in surrounding structures, to untangle without significant effort. Demolition, officials decided, was the only reasonable solution for the residents. This decision did not arrive as a promise of improvement, arrived as uncertainty. Notices were posted, rumors spread. Landlords spoke vaguely of changes. Some tenants were told to prepare to leave. Others were given little information at all. There was no comprehensive plan for rehousing everyone. Compensation where it existed was minimal. The burden of relocation fell on people who already had little. As demolition approached, the street entered a strange final phase. Some residents left early, seeking new lodging before being forced out. Others stayed until the last possible moment, either unable to find alternatives or unwilling to abandon the only home they knew. Empty rooms appeared alongside crowded ones, the social fabric already fragile, grew thinner. Buildings that had leaned together for generations were suddenly marked for separation. Walls were tested, beams examined. The interdependence that had kept the street standing now complicated its destruction. Removing one structure risked destabilizing others. Demolition crews worked carefully, but accidents happened. The street seemed to resist its own erasure, clinging stubbornly to existence, even as it was dismantled piece by piece. The sounds of destruction replaced the familiar noises of daily life: cracking timber, falling brick, dust filling the air. For those still living nearby, the process was unsettling. Their world was literally coming apart. Places where memories had formed rooms, doorways, staircases vanished beneath rubble. The street that had once felt permanent oppressive as it was revealed its fragility. Children watched as walls came down. Some felt excitement, others fear. Adults felt something closer to exhaustion. There was little time for reflection. Survival continued, just in a different form. Finding new shelter became urgent. Old routines were disrupted. Networks of mutual support fractured as people scattered to different parts of the city. When the last buildings were cleared, the street ceased to exist physically. The narrow passage was replaced by wider roads, new developments, and structures more aligned with contemporary ideals. Light entered spaces where darkness had ruled for centuries. Air moved freely where it once stagnated. From an urban planning perspective, this was progress, but progress left no marker for what had been erased. There was no plaque to commemorate the lives lived there, no memorial to acknowledge the endurance of those who had survived within its confines. The street disappeared, not just from the map, but from collective memory. New generations walked over the ground without knowing what had stood there before, who had been displaced to make way for change. For the city, the removal of the street was a success story. It demonstrated action, improvement, modernization. For the people who had lived there, it was more complicated. Some found better housing. Others moved into different slums, repeating the cycle in new locations. Poverty did not vanish with the street. It shifted, redistributed into other narrow spaces, less visible, less controversial. The erasure of the street revealed a truth about how cities manage their past. Physical removal is often mistaken for resolution. By destroying the structure, authorities could claim to have solved the problem even though the underlying conditions remained. The people were moved, not the forces that had confined them. There, over time, references to the street became scarce. It appeared in old documents, maps, and occasional historical accounts, usually as a curiosity. Once the narrowest street in London, this description reduced centuries of human experience to a technical detail, stripping away the reality of what life. Over time, references to the street became scarce. It appeared in old documents, maps, and occasional historical accounts, usually as a curiosity. Once the narrowest street in London, this description reduced centuries of human experience to a technical detail, stripping away the reality of what life there had been like. Narrowness became trivia. Suffering became footnote. Yet the legacy of the street lived on in quieter ways. It influenced future planning decisions, cited as an example of what should never be allowed again. Building codes tightened, minimum widths established, light and ventilation recognized as necessities rather than luxuries. In this sense, the street contributed indirectly to improvements that benefited others. Still, this contribution came at a cost paid by those who never saw the benefit. Their lives served as evidence, their suffering as data. The city learned from them without honoring them. This pattern repeated elsewhere in other slums, in other eras. The street was not unique in its fatality, in its extremity. The disappearance of the street also altered the emotional landscape of the area. Places carry memory even when people do not consciously recognize it. For years after demolition, something lingered in the space, a sense of absence, of something removed. Over time, this too faded, overwritten by new routines, new buildings, new stories. What remains now is the idea of the street reconstructed through records and imagination. It exists as a reminder that history is not only shaped by grand events and famous figures, but by ordinary lives constrained by extraordinary neglect. Its erasure challenges us to consider what is lost when improvement focuses only on appearance, not on people. The street forces uncomfortable questions. Who decides when a place is beyond saving? Who bears the cost of that decision? What does it mean to improve a city if the most vulnerable are simply moved out of sight? These questions do not belong solely to the past. They echo in every modern discussion of redevelopment and renewal. To say that the street was erased is accurate but incomplete. It was removed physically, but its story persists as a warning. It reminds us that neglect can last for centuries and that reform often arrives too late for those most affected. It shows how easily suffering becomes invisible once the structures that contained it are gone. The narrow street no longer casts its shadow between Drury Lane and the Strand, but the conditions that created it, inequality, indifference, prioritization of profit and image over human well-being, have not disappeared so easily. They resurface in new forms, in new places. Whenever cities grow faster than their compassion, the street ended not with justice, but with silence. Its walls fell, its ground was covered, its name faded from everyday speech. Yet the lives lived there were real land, their endurance matter, even if it went unrecorded. In remembering the street, we do not romanticize it. We recognize that survival within such conditions was not a failure, but an achievement forced by circumstance. And we accept that progress, to be meaningful, must account not only for what is built, but for what and who is lost along the way. This is how the street truly ended, not simply demolished, but absorbed into a city eager to forget. And in that forgetting lies its final lesson.